welcome everybody. We are at the April 17th meeting of the Freedom Hub Working Group, and we're going to have a very exciting day here to learn about a pretty major thing that's burning up the headlines on a regular basis, and also to kind of give you a little look forward too, because there's a lot in store, and hopefully you're successfully receiving the weekly Monday 3 o'clock Eastern blast, which gives you an email notification about the upcoming webinar and a link to the one from last week. So this coming Monday, you should get that notice for next Monday and a link to this recording from today. So report back or look in spam because it's coming from MailChimp. So we definitely deliberately send it every week at the appointed time so you know when to be looking for it to make sure you've got it to safe sender. And then, of course, share this link because just by registering, you receive those regularly. Even if you've never attended a single one, we just automate that process until you self-unsubscribe. So just be aware that's how we work it. Charles, before we get into a little bit today, why don't we tell everybody about what's going to be happening in these next coming weeks?
Thank you, Jeff. And this is Charlie Froman. I work with Jeff in our disruption of the health market. And of course, because of our libertarian political backgrounds, we like this webinar we have every week as well to highlight some of our favorite liberty activists and the best issues, because in our opinion, all the issues tie together for your health and well-being and the promise that this country affords us. So we have a variety of issues covered. The next couple of weeks, we're getting back to more standard spending controls. This country is out of control in debt. We do return to health care in 3 weeks with a Tea Party activist. There's a big controversy over whether the Republicans have an answer to the Democrats on health care reform. So some Tea Party activists will answer that question. It's going to really impact the elections. If healthcare is your boat, we do have another webinar every Wednesday, this day at 7 p.m. Eastern. And we have national leaders in reform co-hosting with Jeff on that. And tonight we have a special leader of a very innovative doctors group, Dr. Leah Houston, with HPEC. It's a blockchain community, the Humanitarian Physicians Empowerment Community. So come back tonight at 7 for that more focused health discussion. We are excited, though, to highlight Dr. Jeffrey Singer of the CATO Institute, a longtime surgeon in Arizona. And he is an expert on this opioid crisis, so-called. And this is an issue dear to my heart because I actually lobbied this issue a decade ago. With the late Siobhan Reynolds, whose pain relief organization made a lot of headway in trying to correct the misconception about this crisis, because it's not a crisis addiction, although that's a problem. It's a crisis of under prescription leading people in long-term suffering pain to the streets for dangerous street drugs where they're dying. So this is a very important issue. It really goes right to our core mission with healthcare, and that is health freedom. We do need freedom of choice. We need the doctors to have independence to do their job. And Dr. Singer, I'm very excited to hear you talk about this issue, Jeff Canner. So that's what I have for the preview.
Perfect. Though that was very thorough. That was great. So yes, without further ado, to capitalize on our time, let me make Jeff the presenter, and I'm going to let him take it from there. So here it comes.
Okay, show my screen, and
there we are.
Okay,
perfect.
So
and just from slideshow, play from start, that far left
right.
button. No, yeah, there you go.
Yeah,
go for it.
Okay, so this is actually, of course, a matter of personal autonomy and control of your own body, and also government interference between patient and doctor. But I don't have to probably make this audience too familiar with the fact, because I think most of the listeners, participants are doctors. But back in the 70s, when I was a medical student and then started my residency, that was the era of opiophobia. We kind of were indoctrinated in the Nixon era with the war on drugs to believe that the opioids are extremely dangerous, highly addictive. We should try to avoid prescribing them. And it wasn't just us, it was our patients as well. So I could remember in the early 80s when I was in practice and rounding on my post-surgical patients, when they've been obviously in exquisite pain, and I'd say, you know, I have morphine ordered. Did you let the nurse know that you're in pain? And the patients themselves would say, no, I don't want to get addicted. So it wasn't just the doctors who were expressing opiophobia, but the patients too. All of us culturally had been indoctrinated. But starting in the 70s and extending through the 80s, and I'm not going to, we got to move along some, but these are just examples of some major articles. There were numerous articles presenting in the literature suggesting that, number one, in the medical setting, opioids actually were extremely safe, and number two, we were under-medicating people. People were unnecessarily suffering. And so we were gradually getting encouraged to be a little more liberal in our use of them. And in fact, according to the DEA in the 70s, from 1979 to 1985, already as a result of that, oxycodone consumption rose, hydromorphone consumption rose. By the early 90s, late 80s, we were hearing the director of the National Institute on Drug Abuse tell us healthcare providers that we have this irrational fear and that they're rarely abused for medical purposes. Now, right now, we are hearing over and over again, and the media and the policymakers are in this echo chamber where they cannot disabuse themselves of the notion that everything we're seeing today, all these overdoses, are basically the result of greedy pharmaceutical companies manipulating us unsuspecting doctors into overprescribing opioids because they misled us into thinking that they have a low overdose potential and a low addictive potential. And then we got our population hooked on drugs, and now they're all in the streets with needles in their arms. And that's all because of dumb doctors who are manipulated by greedy pharmaceutical companies. But that really is not true. Of course, I think most of the people on this webinar would agree with me. I'm giving you a little historical background. So by the 90s, finally, doctors and patients were getting more relaxed about using opioids for pain. We all know about the American Pain Society saying that we should make pain the fifth vital sign in 1996. Interestingly, that was the same year that OxyContin was approved by the FDA. OxyContin is just controlled release concentrated oxycodone. In the early part of this century, the Joint Commission was telling doctors, quote, "There's no evidence addiction is a significant issue when patients are given opioids for pain control." Now, we know this on the panel here, but unfortunately, most people in the media, most lay people don't realize that there's a big difference between addiction and chemical dependency. And there's a tendency for people to kind of lump the two in together. But as we all know, tolerance of physical dependence is common with lots of drugs. You develop a physiologic adjustment to the presence of the drug, and you can get withdrawal symptoms if you abruptly stop the drug. Sometimes those withdrawal symptoms, depending on the drug, could be fatal. For example, beta blockers develop physical dependence, and you can't abruptly stop them, or you could get a life-threatening withdrawal reaction. You see that with lots of drugs, and opioids are no different, but also have dependency and tolerance. But addiction, on the other hand, is a behavioral disorder on the molecular level. There's a genetic component to it, and it's a compulsive behavioral disorder where you feel compelled to continue using the drug even in the presence of self-destructive consequences. You cannot get yourself to stop it. You feel driven to it, and that's the difference between addiction and dependence. And there's now when we hear about high addiction rates, lots of times they're really just lumping in dependency rates with that, and I'll get onto that in a minute. So were we being lied to by the greedy pharmaceutical companies about the addiction potential of opioids or the dangers of them? Well, two Cochrane systematic studies in 2010 and 2012, for example, looked at the addiction rates. Now we're talking about addiction, not dependency, in chronic long-term cancer patients, chronic long-term non-cancer pain patients, and they found a roughly 1% addiction rate. Some studies addiction rates can range up to 5%. Just a little over a year ago in the BMJ, researchers at Harvard and Johns Hopkins looked at 568,000 opioid naive patients given opioids acutely for post-op pain between the years 2008 and 2016. These are all in the Aetna database. And they found, looking at misuse codes, they found a total misuse rate of 0.6%. The National Survey on Drug Use and Health found one case of opioid abuse or dependence for every 130 prescriptions written. In 2009, when this was starting to get a lot of public attention, I think probably largely ignored was a study in the American Journal of Psychiatry that looked at over almost 28,000 patients admitted. These were OxyContin addicts admitted to rehab between the years 2001 and 2004. And they found that 78% of them had said they had not gone to a doctor for any medical reason at all. They never went to a doctor to get these drugs. And also 78% reported receiving prior treatment for substance abuse disorder. Also, it's not on the slide, but 77% said they also used cocaine. All this is to suggest that we're dealing with a population of non-medical drug users, not patients being prescribed medications by their doctors. How dangerous is it? Well, the median lethal dose for oxycodone, just to give you some perspective, is 100 milligrams per kilogram in a rat, which means if in a human, adult human, that would be 810 milligram pills for lethal dose. And the LD50 for hydrocodone, as you see, is 375 milligrams per kilogram in a rat, or 4,007.5 milligram hydrocodone pills. Das Gupta at the University of North Carolina was commissioned to do a study, and they followed 2.2 million patients throughout the entire state of North Carolina in the year 2010. They found a total overdose rate of 0.022%. And out of that, 61% were found to have multiple other drugs on board, like benzodiazepines, alcohol, or other opioids. Now, there's a famous study by Amy Bohnert. This was actually the study that led to most policymakers using this 90 morphine milligram equivalence cutoff for what they consider to be high dose, and they're putting all these restrictions on us as a result of that. Well, in this study, they looked at 154,000 VA patients receiving opioids for chronic pain in 04 and 05. Now, the part that all the policymakers seem to overlook is right there in the beginning, that they found the overdose rate was fatal overdose rate, 0.04%. So that was a little over 700 some odd patients out of 150, almost 155,000 patients. That's the overdose rate. So this is contrary to what the narrative would have you believe. It looks like the science suggests it does have a low overdose potential. She also noted in her study that the association of opioid prescribing patterns with risk overdose may vary across groups of patients. We all know that, but when we're put on these one-size-fits-all guidelines, it doesn't take into account lots of other factors like the patient's underlying physiology, what the cause of the pain, what other medications they may be on, etc. She understood this because she's a doctor. Now, so what happened? So between 1999 and 2015, the number of opioid prescriptions tripled. We had, of course, a lot of this was because we doctors were getting much more generous in prescribing opioids for pain. Okay. Now, some of us, I'm not going to try to, make this. I'm not going to be deceptive. I'm sure there are many of us who prescribed too liberally for the medical setting, just like many of us may be too liberal with our prescription of antibiotics. Some of us, I was overprescribed an antihypertensive when I was walking around with dizzy spells. So I'm not saying we doctors are perfect, but I'll get into more of the numbers in a minute. The fact is, though, that the more drugs that are prescribed, of course, the more become accessible for diversion into the black market by people who want to divert it into the black market. And of course, we now have evidence that there was no question overzealous sales reps. Purdue back in, I think it was 2010, settled in a case, a misbranding case. Some doctors were operating pill mills. I've written about this. I would argue that all of this, in fact, today, if you got the news, you saw that the DOJ just arrested 60 doctors, dentists, nurses, and pharmacists in Appalachia who were not only selling opioids rapidly, some of them were extracting sexual favors in return for opioids. I blame this on prohibition, because prohibition creates incentives, lucrative incentives for corrupt people, because that's what prohibition does. So if you're looking for a source of the problem is prohibition itself, not the drug, and not doctors in general or nurses in general or any of that sort of thing. The number of opioid overdose deaths also quadrupled during that same period, and during the early part of this century, OxyContin was the most popular diverted prescription opioid for abuse for obvious reasons. It's much more concentrated than oxycodone or hydrocodone. So if you crush it and snort it or liquefy it, inject it, you get much more bang for your buck. But even as early as the early part of the century, there's a lot of evidence suggesting there's socio-cultural factors involved. In fact, a GAO report in 2003 noted that most of the abuse and diversion seemed to be in areas that had a long history of drug abuse going back decades, and they also had a long history of alcohol abuse and bootlegging of alcohol. So they're already in the early part of this century, some people were starting to notice socio-cultural factors, and I'll get to this more in a minute. This is an important study. I published this along with Jacob Sullum, who you may be familiar with. He's a senior editor for Reason magazine, and Michael Shatman, who's on the faculty at Tufts University Medical School. He's a practicing clinical psychologist and pain specialist in the Journal of Pain Research just in this past February. What we did was we looked at numbers from the National Survey on Drug Use and Health, which began in the year 2002. It's conducted by the National Institute on Drug Abuse. And what was really interesting, from 2002 to 2014, each year, the past month non-medical use of pain relievers among adults aged 12 or older, basically unchanged for those 12 years, a flat line. After 2014, they changed the questionnaire. Even with the change, we saw no difference. But just to keep it so couldn't be accused of talking apples and oranges, we're just going to leave it during that period when the questionnaire was the same. Also, during that same period, pain reliever use disorder in the past year among adults 12 or older, unchanged. So you have a flat line from 2002 to 2014. Meanwhile, during that same period, the non-medical use, the number of prescriptions during that same period doubled. The number of prescription of opioids per 100 population doubled, and that's CDC numbers. So what does that tell us? That tells us that doesn't seem to be any relationship between the number of prescriptions written and the percentage of people who are non-medical using prescription painkillers or have a prescription painkiller use disorder, which again argues for the fact that there's a population of people who are non-medical users, and the problem that we're seeing with people dying from non-medical use of drugs is not because you or I are prescribing pain medicine to our patients. It's because when we have drug prohibition, people are using drugs in an underground market, and using drugs in that setting are much more dangerous. And that's why we're seeing an overdose rate. So since the National Survey on Drug Use and Health, almost since it began taking the survey, found that less than 25% of non-medical users of opioids ever get them from a doctor. 75% get them from a friend, family, or dealer. The National Survey also found that non-medical use of prescription opioids peaked in the year 2012, and total opioid use in 2014 was lower than in 2012. We have updated numbers from this slide. Since 2008, the number of high-dose prescriptions of opioids, that's 90 morphine milligram equivalents per day or greater, has dropped between 2008 and 2017, 58%. And total opioid prescribing has dropped 29%. Also, the overwhelming majority of people found to have opioid-related overdoses have multiple drugs on board. These are statistics from New York City in the year 2016. 75% of their overdoses that year were from fentanyl or heroin, and 97% of them had multiple drugs on board, 46% being cocaine. So this, again, is not the profile of patients being prescribed opioids by healthcare providers for their pain. I'm just going to skip this. So I talked about socio-cultural issues. Most people don't realize this, but this is not this problem is not limited to the United States. Canada has a high opioid overdose problem. Australia does, and Europe does as well. In fact, particularly in the UK, Spain, and Sweden. And in a lot of those countries, people can't, quote unquote, doctor shop for meds. So there is an overdose rate. Now, the death rate is not nearly as great in Europe as it is in the United States. A couple of things may be involved there. One is they need to get to work on collecting the data because there are multiple countries. The European Monitoring Center for Drugs and Drug Addiction, that's their agency that reports on this, they admittedly are behind, well behind the CDC in data collection. But that's only one part of it. I think another part of it is that in those countries for decades, they've been much more liberal in the use of harm reduction, as opposed to just trying to lock people up and do interdiction. So things like needle exchange programs, safe injection rooms, and the medication-assisted treatment have been much more widely used, and I'll get to that a little later as well, in Europe, in Canada, and in Australia. And I would argue that has a lot to do with why the death rates aren't as bad as here, where we tend to be resistant to that. Again, socio-cultural factors. CICERO, who's Ted Cicero's at WashU, he's a psychiatrist and he does a lot of research on addiction. He reported in November 2017, this is frightening to me. 33% of heroin abusers entering rehab in 2015 said they initiated use with heroin, as opposed to 8.7% who said that 10 years earlier. So we're seeing people willing to take risks that earlier generations would not have been willing to take. And to me, this was one of the most important studies because this did a lot to validate what I've been saying. This came out in September 2018 by researchers at the University of Pittsburgh Graduate School of Medicine, Graduate School of Public Health. In fact, the dean of that school spoke at a conference we had at the CATO Institute about 3 weeks ago on harm reduction. What they did is they were able to dig into numbers from the CDC going back into the 70s. And that wasn't easy because terminology has changed over the years and data collection has changed over the years. But using good statistical methodology that they explain in their paper, they were able to come to the following conclusion. Basically, quote, the US drug overdose epidemic has been inexorably tracking along an exponential growth curve since at least 1979. There have been transient periods of minor acceleration or deceleration. The overall drug overdose mortality rate has regularly returned to the exponential growth curve. When he presented to us, he showed us all of their graphs. It was remarkable. There basically has been a nonstop, inexorable growth in overdoses. It's just the only thing that's changed over the years is which drug is in vogue. And also in blue writing here, you see the substance abuse started before the availability of synthetic opioids and may have only a little to do with the prescribing habits of doctors or the pushy habits of drug makers, the team at the University of Pittsburgh found. And now it's continuing, according to Dr. Burke of Pitt. He says that they see no evidence of any deviation from the trend. And now the big thing on the horizon is methamphetamine and cocaine is back up at record highs, actually. So I would argue, before we get onto interventions, that while the standard narrative is that we doctors hooked our patients, maybe unwittingly, on highly addictive, highly overdose-prone opioids and created this problem, I would argue no. First of all, in the medical setting, the science continues to show that there's a very low addiction rate potential. In fact, Nora Volkow of the National Institute on Drug Abuse, I might have jumped past that slide. She even said that opioids given in the medical setting, the addiction rate is extremely low, even in those with pre-existing vulnerabilities. Meanwhile, we've seen this growing population of non-medical users of both licit and illicit drugs. Maybe some of them are self-medicating. There are a lot of very complex explanations that are beyond my area of expertise, and it's probably not one simple explanation. It's probably multifactorial, but this has been a growing trend in the West in general, and the fact that diverted prescription opioids played a big role in it during the early part of this century was the latest expression of it. And as we made diverted prescription opioids less available, the non-medical users have just migrated over to the next thing they can get. So what are interventions that we've done so far? Well, we've done prescription drug monitoring programs. We all are familiar with that. Every state's got it now. And these are just two studies, but there's actually another one that's in production right now. I've had a chance of looking at the unpublished paper, all showing the same thing, that they are succeeding in getting prescribers to prescribe less prescription opioids, but it had no impact on the overdose rate, and in fact may be driving non-medical users to more dangerous substitutes like heroin and fentanyl. Also, starting in 2010, we developed abuse deterrent formulations. As OxyContin's patent was about to run out in 2010, aware of the overdose issue, they came up with a reformulation that enabled them to get an extension on their patent that cannot be crushed for snorting or dissolved for injecting. And it was approved rapidly by the FDA, and studies have shown that within a month of Purdue making the only version of its OxyContin available, the abuse deterrent formulation, there was a 1-to-1 substitution of heroin for OxyContin by non-medical users. And I have a policy analysis that I published on this in February 2018 that looks at several other studies on this, but there are numerous studies now showing that abuse deterrent formulations have only served to drive non-medical users to more dangerous drugs. Nevertheless, the FDA continues to encourage pharmaceutical companies to come up with abuse deterrent formulations. I don't know about the people on this panel today, but when I prescribe oxycodone for my post-op patient, it never even occurs to me to tell them not to crush it, to snort it, or not to liquefy it, inject it, but just to take it with a glass of water, because these are medical users, not non-medical users, so it never occurs to me. Meanwhile, the pharmaceutical companies are happy to oblige the desire of the FDA to develop abuse deterrent formulations, because oftentimes that gives them a chance to what some economists call evergreen their patents, because you get patent extensions with reformulations, which maintains their monopoly status of that drug a while longer and allows them to charge more. And the DEA has been ordering reduction in the manufacture of opioids every year since 2017. And of course, you know, Friedrich Hayek used to talk of the fatal conceit. To think that any agency is charged, the DEA is charged with trying to figure out just how many pain medications are needed for a population of 330 million people in the coming year. How could anybody presume to know the answer to that? But that's what they try to do. And of course, they've been deciding that we need less than we used to. Of course, we're all familiar with the prescription limits that are being placed on all of us doctors. These are based upon the CDC guidelines that came out in 2016. Many of you are aware that they've come under a lot of criticism from a lot of scholarly experts that the guidelines are not evidence-based. But then again, the CDC themselves said that when they published their guidelines, they said they're using type 4 evidence, which they define as the weakest type of evidence, a very high risk of being found to not be true. And even then, what they said was, with this type 4 evidence, quote, when opioids are used for acute pain, clinicians should prescribe the lowest effective dose of immediate release opioids and should prescribe no greater quantity than needed for the expected duration of pain severe enough to require opioids. Well, tell me something I don't know as a doctor. But then they said 3 days or less will often be sufficient. More than 7 days will rarely be needed. Now, again, this is based on type 4 evidence. They also said that these are not meant to be prescriptive, but rather suggestive voluntary standards, and that they're based on observational studies that have notable limitations, and that clinicians know their patients better than anybody and should obviously use their best judgment weighing risks and benefits. But when policymakers, particularly politicians, see this, I'm going to go back again, what they get is, oh, okay, so you don't need more than 3 days for pain medicine. So we've been prescribing more than 3 days. Let's make a law, no more than 3 days, which is what they did in Kentucky. In Massachusetts, they said, no, they said more 7 days, so they made it 7. In my state of Arizona, just took effect this year, they split the baby, so it's 5 days. But all of these politicians seem to know just how many days of pain a pain medication a person needs, even though the CDC themselves said, we're not sure, and this is not meant to be prescriptive. And of course, many of you are aware that just in the last week, the CDC issued a clarification because they realized that a lot of states are passing these guidelines based on their 2016 guidelines that are making a lot of chronic pain patients get abruptly terminated from their chronic pain medication. It's causing a lot of people to be desperate. Some are turning to the black market. Some are committing suicide. And they actually clarified saying, we did not mean that you should abruptly terminate patients who are on long-time chronic pain medication. There should be they should be gradually tapered, no abrupt tapering. But they had to issue those clarifications because politicians don't know how to interpret this. Only people in the science fields understand guidelines are just guidelines with limitations. So how's all this working out? Well, this is a busy slide. Bottom line, that overdose deaths from fentanyl, according to the CDC numbers, increased 71% from 2013 through 2017, which is the most recent year for which we have official numbers, because they're always about a year behind. Overdose rate for heroin increased 33% a year from 2010 to 2014, and then 19% a year ever since. But meanwhile, the overdose rate for prescription pain relievers has stayed steady, increasing at a rate of about 3% a year from 2009 on. Actually, it's showing signs now of declining a little bit. I have some more on the latest numbers. Fentanyl was found in 40% of total overdose deaths, that's total, which includes meth, cocaine, etc., in 2017. According to the CDC's numbers for 2017, fentanyl and heroin made up 75% of opioid-related overdose deaths that year. Out of the roughly 30% that contained of overdose deaths that contained prescription pain relievers, 68% had multiple other drugs on board, including heroin, fentanyl, alcohol, benzodiazepines, cocaine. If you adjusted for that and just focused on overdose from prescription pain relievers that had no other drugs on board, it was somewhere below 10% of overdose deaths in 2017. These are some numbers you could see how things have evolved over the years. So synthetic opioids other than methadone, that's fentanyl. Look at that go up, and now for 2017, it's gone up even higher. This is all CDC numbers, but the natural and semi-synthetic opioids are tapering off. That's prescription pain relievers. Oh, this is important. Let me back up here. Methamphetamine is back up. Now, in 2005, some of you may remember, we weren't talking about the opioid crisis, we were talking about the meth crisis, because the war on drugs is a game of whack-a-mole. So right now we're whacking the opioids, but we'll get back to whacking the meth in a short while. So they passed a law making Sudafed behind the counter because there were meth labs all over the country that were making meth out of Sudafed, which apparently is easy to do if you have some basic chemistry knowledge. And then the SWAT team started swooping in on all these meth labs. So for 1 year, the meth-related death rate actually leveled off, you might see. But I'll try to show it here. Here we go. But then it started back up again because meth was the only business that the Mexican cartels weren't involved in. They were busy smuggling in marijuana, cocaine, heroin. There were so many meth labs all over the country that there was just no niche for them, no market for them. But this new policy opened up a whole new market for them. So they started getting into the business and started manufacturing meth down in Mexico. So in 2007, we leaned on Mexico to make Sudafed behind the counter there as well. But by this time, the cartels were invested in this. And if anybody's watched Breaking Bad, you'll know this. They've quickly discovered that you can make meth out of phenyl-2-propanone, also called P2P, which the bikers were making it out of. So they just switched over, and of course, using their well-developed smuggling lines, they have been pouring meth into this country, generally to compete with cocaine, which is largely coming in from South America. So they're trying to offer meth as an alternative. And now meth has been on a steady increase. In 2017, it was up to 10,721 meth-related deaths, as opposed to 1,887 reported in 2011. Cocaine is also on the increase. They're not getting noticed very much because we're talking about opioids, but bottom line is that the war on drugs is, like I say on this slide, it's like a game of whack-a-mole. And this is, of course, the thesis of my entire presentation, which is the so-called opioid crisis is just the latest chapter in the war, in drug prohibition and the war on drugs. So this is an interesting chart. You can see the trend line for overdoses from heroin and fentanyl versus prescription pain relievers. And the blue line is the yellow line is a trend for prescription pain relievers. And then with heroin and fentanyl, the orange line is the actual, and the light blue line is the trend. And you can see the way it's heading. That was 2015. This is 2016. It's even gotten more magnified. There's another presentation of it. And this is an interesting curve, an interesting chart. The CDC began keeping track of annual prescription rates in 2006. And from 2006 to 2010, the number of prescriptions per 100,000 population tracked roughly the same with the total opioid overdose rate from any opioid. Then they began to diverge in 2010. 2010 is when the abuse deterrent formulations came on the market, when the PDMPs started to really proliferate, and when all of the efforts at interdiction, law enforcement started to come into play. So now you can see that as prescription rates have continued to come down, the red line, the overdose rate continues to go up. You can see 2010 is the inflection point. So with all this, what do I suggest we do? Well, first of all, you need to recognize that the opioid crisis is really a prohibition crisis. So back off on doctors, and I don't just mean to say doctors, on healthcare practitioners. Let us do our job. Yeah, there are some bad ones. They're bad in every field. There are corruptible ones because humans are corruptible. We learned of that today. But for the most part, the overwhelming majority of us, we're a profession, we have a calling, we want to do the right thing. Let us use our judgment. That's number one. Number two, end the prescription limits. They're not evidence-based. People are not one size fits all. Number three, the FDA should stop encouraging abuse deterrent formulations. It's only adding to healthcare costs because it's extending companies' patents, and it's not doing any good. It's probably just making the harm worse. And end the focus on all the supply side. So Portugal came to this conclusion in 2001. By that time, they had the highest overdose rate in the European Union. They were a basket case, and they decided to try something completely different. So they totally decriminalized all drugs. Now that's not the same thing as legalizing it, which I think would be better but it's politically more doable because when you decriminalize it, you're not sending the message that you think it's okay. You're just saying you're not going to put people in jail for it. Now they still go after big time smuggling operations, but not the small time ones. And instead of putting people in jail, all the efforts that they were putting into law enforcement, they put into making harm reduction programs more available. I would tell you that legalizing is even better because if it's decriminalized, you still have to get it on the black market. So you still don't necessarily know what you're buying. When I go into a store to buy a bottle of liquor and it says 40% alcohol, it never occurs to me that the manufacturer's lying to me and it's really 80% alcohol, or maybe it's wood alcohol and not ethyl alcohol. None of that occurs to me because it's legal. There's accountability, there's liability, there's competition, etc. When I'm buying something on the illegal market, I have no idea that I could trust what's in it. And that's why a lot of people are dying. So many drugs now are adulterated with fentanyl. In fact, the report just came out the other day, 45% of cocaine now in, I'm trying to remember the state, it was just in the news the other day, 45% of cases of cocaine have been found to have fentanyl in it. So that's the new thing now. Fentanyl is being used with cocaine. It used to be popular to mix heroin with cocaine for what they call speedballing, which is when you want to kind of soften the come down after the cocaine wears off with heroin. Now they're using fentanyl. And a lot of unsuspecting cocaine users don't know that, and they're dying from fentanyl overdoses. Big problem, particularly in New England. So when Portugal did this, by 2015, they found they had a 75% reduction in their known heroin users. And now they have the lowest overdose rate in the European Union, 6 per million, as opposed to 312 per million in the US. The director of their drug program in Portugal said that they noticed that as people stopped worrying about being treated as criminals, they were actually coming up to policemen and asking for help and getting directed into rehab programs, etc. So they also have found that there has been no increase in teen drug use the teen drug use hasn't gone down, but it's tracked the same as it is throughout the European Union. It has not changed, and there's been a decrease in adult non-medical drug use. It's such success that the Norwegian legislature recently voted to authorize their executive branch to implement a decriminalization program in Norway. I don't know how that's coming along yet. So if decriminalization is not politically realistic in the United States right now, and it clearly isn't, so what else can we do? Well, at least put the emphasis on harm reduction programs, as is done in the rest of the world, even where they haven't decriminalized. Harm reduction, as you probably know, is the it's the realistic understanding that you're never going to have a drug-free society. It's non-judgmental. It's not condoning the non-medical use of a lot of these substances. It's just saying, let's focus on trying to make it less dangerous for you. You have a less likely chance of spreading disease, contracting HIV or hepatitis, or overdosing. So well known, we had a conference on this at the CATO Institute on March 21st. The entire conference was excellent. It was an all-day conference. There were 5 separate panels, each about an hour long, and they're all archived at the CATO website. I encourage anybody who's interested to go look at it. And since it's archived and it's on demand, you can kind of view it at your leisure. But we covered all of these areas. Of course, the best known are medication-assisted treatment, like methadone programs or buprenorphine. Naltrexone is not the greatest. It's got limitations, and you need to be completely detoxed before you start on naltrexone. But methadone and buprenorphine are very good medication-assisted treatment programs. Now, here's another interesting thing. We doctors are allowed, if you want to take an 8-hour course and get a special Data X license from the DEA, we could prescribe Suboxone. Of course, there are limits on how many patients we could take in, and those limits were increased in October with some congressional legislation. But I could prescribe it on an ambulatory basis to my patients, particularly if I'm in primary care and I have an interest in treating substance abuse disorder. If I'm not comfortable treating substance abuse disorder, I could refer to somebody who is. Methadone, on the other hand, in this country, which has been proven since the 60s to work as a medication-assisted treatment, in this country, the DEA took it over from the FDA in 2001. And their restrictions were so onerous that initially there was a 20% reduction nationwide in methadone clinics. They gradually made their comeback. But there's so many regulations that there's not enough of them, number one. Number two, the patient is required to take the methadone in the presence of somebody at the clinic because, an addict, quote unquote, can't be trusted. So when you've got a person who's addicted, maybe even living on the streets, to ask them to have discipline, to come in once or twice a day to take a medication in your presence is not realistic for a lot of patients. On top of that, if you live in an underserved area, you live in a rural area, to think you're going to travel maybe 100 miles every day to the methadone clinic to get your it's not going to happen. Now, in France, in Canada, the UK, and Australia, for decades, they've allowed doctors who are interested in treating substance abuse disorder to prescribe methadone like we allow them to prescribe Suboxone on an ambulatory basis. Now, that's a reform that I think should be undertaken. There was a pilot program conducted by Boston University Medical School about a year ago, reported in the New England Journal of Medicine, that was very successful. It was administered by primary care physicians in the Boston area. This is, in my opinion, low-hanging fruit legislatively. Congress could do this. It doesn't require spending money. It requires relaxing the regulations so that doctors who want to treat substance abuse disorder with methadone could come to them. You could have your office you could have a practice in a neighborhood in an area that has a lot of drug abuse, maybe in a storefront in a strip mall. You want to treat patients with methadone, you should be able to do that. So that's one. Needle exchange programs proven since the 80s in this country to significantly reduce the spread of HIV and hepatitis. Originally, it was started to stop hepatitis B, then hepatitis C. But in over 20 states in this country, including my own state of Arizona, it's impeded because the states have anti-paraphernalia laws. So technically, you could be arrested if you have a needle exchange program. In my state, we have over 7 of them, but they're against the law technically. The police support needle exchange programs because they don't like getting stuck with contaminated needles either when they rescue people. So they tend to look the other way when they see some people come over, volunteers in a van exchanging needles. But these are all privately funded charitable organizations, and if they were legalized, they could open up in a center. They could advertise their location. They could have fundraisers. Right now, they can't do any of that stuff. We're having a hard time getting the paraphernalia laws repealed in Arizona. Also, in the last few years, fentanyl test strips have become available. They're actually they're an off-label use of urine fentanyl test strips. It's made by a company in Canada. Most of these needle exchange programs and these other harm reduction programs, they distribute them to the users so they can test their heroin to make sure there's no fentanyl in it, or if there is, to adjust their dose. The data suggests, and you'll see that if you watch the video from our conference, majority of the heroin users actually don't want fentanyl. They view fentanyl as an adulterant that's used by the drug dealers many of you may have heard of what's called the iron law of prohibition. Prohibition has economic incentives to develop more potent, more compact forms of whatever it is that is prohibited, because then it's easier to smuggle, to transport, and you can subdivide it into more parts and make more money. That's why during alcohol prohibition, they weren't smuggling in beer or wine, they were smuggling in spirits, whiskey, etc. Well, it's the same thing with fentanyl. Fentanyl is mainly used to enhance the potency of heroin and cocaine and other things that are being smuggled into this country. And a lot of heroin users, if they know there's fentanyl, that either will avoid it or will use a much smaller dose. In my state of Arizona, fentanyl test strips are considered paraphernalia. So it's a felony to give somebody a test strip to test their drug. So these are things that need to be improved. As you may be aware, and it was the opening panel on this at our harm reduction conference dealt with this, safe injection facilities, that's even better than needle exchange, because needle exchange is good as far as it goes. You give the needle to the person and they go off somewhere, and if they use and they overdose, there's nobody there to rescue them. And then after they use it a few times, they share the needle or sell it or whatever. And the safe injection facility, which has been around since the 80s, you come in to a clean place where you could wash your hands and wash whatever. You're given a clean needle and syringe. You inject in the presence of a staff person who's got naloxone handy in case you overdose. And then they take the needle and syringe from you when you leave. And they tell you can come back as many times a day as you need to. So that obviously that prevents the dissemination of dirty needles, and that makes it more likely that somebody's going to be there to rescue you if you die. And in this country, it's against the law. They're trying to get it started in several cities, most notably Philadelphia. And then finally, heroin maintenance is being used in several countries. As you can see on the slide, it's been proven as another form of medication-assisted treatment in cases where methadone and buprenorphine don't work. There's also a lot of evidence that cannabis may have a role not just in reducing the need for opioids for pain, but it may have a role as a medication-assisted treatment and as a treatment for opioid withdrawal. So in summary, I'm just going to skip because we're running out of time. This has never been about doctors prescribing opioids. No doubt some are overprescribing, just like some doctors overprescribe lots of things, but that the focus is on the wrong cause. This has always been primarily a result of drug prohibition. If you want to see the overdose rate come down, if you want to see deaths come down, end prohibition. If we can't do that, at least change the goal to harm reduction. And now I'll take any questions you have.
That's perfect timing, Jeff. All right, great.
I got the message.
Yeah, that was good. That was good. All right, I'm doing a little unmuting, so please, everybody, just got to either raise your hand here or,
Jeff?
you can ask. I was going to ask Lauren if you might want to kind of kick us off. So hold on a second. I'm going to unmute her because she's the first person with her hand up there. Okay, I have you unmuted. Ooh, it says you need to add the audio pin there, Lauren, because I can't unmute you at this point.
Yeah, while she does that, go ahead.
I guess
I just want to know, is are my slides still on the screen, or you have the screen?
They are. No, they still have it up here on your end.
Okay.
If you want to, while Lauren figures that out, Jeff, let's invite Dr. Hurwitz to, respond to Dr. Singer's response. And
sure.
Those who don't know Dr. Hurwitz, he was jailed as a drug kingpin for doing his job, helping patients with their pain years ago. I was at the trial. Dr. Hurwitz, any quick thoughts here? We kind of ran over time with the presentation.
Can you hear me?
I can.
Okay. Well, my initial thought is that I agree with essentially all of the both attitude and data that you presented. I was familiar with much of it. I had written a paper actually during the time that I was preparing for trial, which utilized the then National Study on Drug Use and Health to and came to very similar conclusions of the lack of relationship between doctor prescribing and abuse. The point that I would make is that the apparently consistent and systemic rise in drug misuse is a sociological problem, which is more related to economic and social developments than it is to medical practice. I mean, that's and that addressing the epidemic, if we agree with that term, probably involves trying to figure out what to do with the people who are most prone to use drugs or to become addicted. That is, whether it's educational opportunity. One of the interesting statistics is that the peak of drug misuse was around 21 or 22. The typical age distribution was starting at age 12, early adolescence, and for the most part tapering off by the late 20s, when people got jobs and got married and did other things with their lives. I don't know if that age distribution is still valid. Maybe you have more recent data than I am recalling. But
I don't know.
But those, at least at the time, were considered, or well, in my estimate, were times of significant social stress. That is, adolescence is perhaps the most stressful time in development in life. Since you're coming out of the domination of parents and trying to figure out what to do with oneself in the world, and drug use is in some sense a response to that stress. Now, it may be that social policies that would address those factors which predispose to stress or which provide alternative mechanisms to alleviate or to deal with it would be a kind of approach to that issue. Anyway, that's one point I have, which is that the studies on the diseases of desperation, the higher suicide rate, the higher alcoholism rate, and the higher rate of deaths from drug abuse really goes hand in hand.
Well, I don't disagree with anything you said, although I think we need to be careful because we don't want to be like the policymakers and come up with a one-size-fits-all answer. I think what you said probably is a definite part of it, but it's multifactorial. I don't think it's a coincidence that the suicide rate is continuing to go up. We see an increase in single-parent families. That may be playing a role in some cases, not necessarily, but at least in some cases. You could argue that as more the social media has been a two-edged sword. On the one hand, we're more connected than ever before. On the other hand, we sort of get isolated because we become so almost sucked into that nexus of social media that we don't communicate with in any other way with other people. So I just think it's probably very complicated, I think there are socio-cultural and psychosocial and socioeconomic factors that have been at play for the last several decades, which is why we're seeing not only an increased population of people who are non-medically using, and many of whom may be self-medicating, but we're also seeing people, like I mentioned earlier, willing to take risks that, I personally, in my generation, if somebody had given me, marijuana, had then said, hey, you want to try this stuff, heroin, I would have headed for the hills when I heard that. That was something that you just wanted to stay away from. That's the way, at least in my generation, we were led to believe about it. Now you're seeing young people start off with that. In fact, Dr. Ciccerone at our conference said, when he was interviewing heroin addicts, a lot of the young ones, when he asked them to just start with pills, they'd say things, well, I dabbled in pills here and there. They really didn't do it for me, so I went right to heroin. That's a common answer now. So something is going on, and to think that you could fix this by, telling doctors how many pain. First of all, the This has never was about doctors treating patients.
Jeff,
That's basically it. Yes.
We're going to go ahead to, Lauren is ready to answer questions, Jeff. Go ahead.
One last question, because we're literally coming on our.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Lauren, go ahead.
We could, like I said, we can keep rolling. Lauren, go ahead.
Okay, great. Thank you. And you're right. Something is going on, and there is much more to this. We had actually just returned this week from a trip to Washington, D.C., where we had released our dossier, where we had outlined, we had tracked this back legally as to what was going on, as the public narrative did not match the science, as you presented very well in this webinar today. And in doing so, we had found in section 4305 of the ACA, the federal government had convened a new committee that consists of the agency heads of all agencies in the federal government in order to deploy a population-based clinical trial and a health and all policies approach to management of public health and individual health. And that is a lot of why we are seeing these problems come out, and different areas where the narrative does not match the science, and also that we're seeing just really nobody is being listened to, and all of our science is falling on deaf ears. And we're seeing this negative bias language that is coming out, and it is all essentially a marketing campaign to work with the public to enable these social economical changes as they are studying the social determinants of health to try to give interventional strategies and things of that nature. But the main core issue with this is that the population has been enrolled into a clinical study without their consent or knowledge, and the investigators are actively working with legislate changing laws to shape and allow the study rather than shape the laws around the needs of the public and the public's health. And there have been a group of organizations that have been identified as essentially the architects that started this back in 2010 that are really controlling this whole issue, and appears to be quite the conglomerate monopoly that they've built for this health. When you shuffle the boards, it's all essentially the same group. So that is why I think, you know, we do have game-changing information. We've seen some great changes coming out, some announcements from FDA immediately after presenting this information. And we think that this information can be very valuably used to try to roll back and force in that common sense, because we are being intentionally gaslit, to be able to implement the laws and changes to move forth with this study, as they're collecting our EMRs to study pain in itself. And the opioid crisis itself was really low-hanging fruit, and you know, an ability to leverage this study to take place, as they knew the American public was going to resist it, as it was quoted quite often throughout the report, how they were going to deal with how the public would not allow this because of the American values of freedom of choice and privacy.
Lauren, what was the comment you made about the state databases and trying to stop Missouri so that we don't have...
Yes, right now this report has been advanced in the state of Missouri since it went released on Friday. And there are state senators that are now using this finding to try to stop the implementation of the PDMP in the 50th state altogether, as the PDMP is being leveraged and is directly tied to this illegal population-based study that has clearly caused great bodily harm, physical and mental, and has caused death at this point. So it should absolutely not be moving forward, because PDMPs are being used and the information is being shared with a whole plethora of private enterprise. And at this point, it's gone way beyond the purposes of HIPAA and protecting you as the patient. It is becoming a data machine.
Well, thanks, Lauren. And Jeff, I know we've run out of time here. What do you want to close with?
Yes, go ahead, Jeff. Just finish it up for us.
The other Jeff, I'm sorry.
No, you go, Jeff. Give us like a 1 minute response. We've got time.
No, go ahead. I have to start my clinic right now. So.
Oh, there you go. Okay, you see, he's a busy guy. Well, I appreciate today. Yeah. That was fantastic. Then we'll clean it up, and obviously we could have gone on for hours, and we'll have to have you back. So thanks and enjoy.
Thank you.
Yes, please. Again, real quick, this is all recorded. We're going to send the link around. As you'll see, here's a link to share, and also where we've got videos posted currently. The other little fast thing is we're also promoting was the idea of the 7 o'clock one where this is going to be the same kind of a concept, but with doctors engaged talking about free market healthcare in the medical world and what's going on over there. So it's quite a exciting call as well. Other than that, we got our people coming up next week. And if you want to give a 2-second rundown on that, and then we'll close it out here and keep it in under 5. Now, you know, we'll done be 5:05. Ooh, stumbling around there.
Thanks, Jeff and Charlie here. So please come back tonight at 7 Eastern for our blockchain community, where Dr. Leah Houston will talk about that mechanism to free doctors from control by big insurers and big hospitals. And we'll be back to Liberty Policy next Wednesday at 4 Eastern and every week thereafter. The next couple of weeks will be some activists holding politicians' feet to the fire for overspending. And then in 3 weeks, we'll be back to healthcare with some Tea Party leaders to talk about the big fight for the elections over who's got the best healthcare reform plan. So come back every week. We're all about health freedom and freedom in general. And thanks, Jeff.
Thank you. And thank everyone for being here today.